Cecil.
Thank you, my lady. May I please call Linda Dinsdale?
I just ask you to stand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing.
and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Dinsdale, thank you very much for coming along to help us today.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Dinsdale. You're here today to tell us about your daughter Cheryl, her experiences and indeed your family's experiences during the pandemic. Cheryl, your much-loved daughter, sadly died at the age of 50 on the 27th of April 2020, so at the outset of the pandemic.
Yes.
In terms of your family, Cheryl was your second child of 3.
That's right.
And she was very close in age to her older brother, 11 months between them.
Yes.
And you described them effectively growing up as twins as a consequence. But more broadly, it's right to say that you and your family are indeed very close more generally.
Yes, we are. We always have been. Yes. Still are. Yes. Did so much together. Everything was done together, from children right through to adulthood. After marriage, we're still very close family. But Cheryl particularly so as well, very much so. After she became ill, she became dependent, and we were even closer even then. Yes.
May I just ask you, Mrs. Dinsdale, just to keep your voice up a little bit? It's
Yeah.
dropping a small amount.
Okay.
So if you can just
I
try
wonder
and
if we could get
move the
the
mic.
microphone, help if it was a bit closer. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, my lady. If I can turn now to Cheryl, you paint a very vivid picture within your witness statement. She was obviously a very bright, vivacious woman. She's a natural leader, as you describe her. She had a passion for singing, which I understand is something that's more broadly enjoyed across your family.
Yes.
But in particular, musical theatre and dance. And she was also very talented in that because she competed in Latin American ballroom dancing from when she was 7 years old all the way until she was 22.
Of course.
Similarly, she excelled in her working life. In adulthood, she worked in the Houses of Parliament for over 20 years. What type of work was that?
She worked for various committees and enjoyed each one, if it was either foreign affairs or... And she worked in Strasbourg. She went every January and spent 3 or 4 weeks working there as well. And she would be setting up all the meetings and everything that was going on. And thoroughly enjoyed working there, but unfortunately had to take medical retirement from there. And as I say, it was about 23 years she'd actually worked there. Having come from, she was actually a tutor for shorthand typing and things, and she actually did that prior to it. But she worked there, and now on the COVID wall, her heart is facing straight over to where she worked, which is a bit poignant, really. But, so she's still at work.
She's still at work.
No, she's no longer here. Yeah.
And indeed, when she took medical retirement, her role at that point was as head of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
Yes, yes.
She was able to combine that with an active family life. She raised her son James.
That's right, with James. But from the age of 2, because of Cheryl with her work and her commitment to work, he actually lived with my husband and I as well. So we all brought him up.
Indeed.
But of course, she had a lot of holiday time when the house was in recess and things. So she spent a lot of time then. But other than that, he was with us, as she was as well, yeah.
And that's why I say you were particularly close as a
Very
family.
close, yes, yeah.
You explain in your witness statement that in 2010 she began to develop various health problems and was subsequently diagnosed with chronic pain and fibromyalgia.
Exactly, yes.
And it was 2013 that she took medical retirement. And by her early 40s, sadly, she'd become almost entirely immobile and was in a wheelchair.
Yeah, she was in a wheelchair. She could still possibly move from, say, the chair to another area, but not without assistance. And the pain just got quite severe, really.
Initially, you explained that she had carers to come and help and assist, and then you took on that role yourself.
Yes.
And then
'cause-
following on from that, she...
Well, I took on because we had converted our home to bring it into our home for us, so that she actually lived with us completely. And but then my husband was also, I was caring for him at the same time, and my grandson as well, unfortunately. But no, they came in, as I say, because we are close families, still are. But I was actually working as well, so I had my own thing to do, and it just became too much, and we had to have carers. But this is what I was advised through my local surgery to do this anyway, the GP, and we had carers, but unfortunately they couldn't do exactly everything she wanted because she did start to need a lot more time. Yeah, with a carer.
And her care needs became such that that was when you found a home for her to move into.
Well, what actually happened was, no, she was in hospital. She was actually in hospital, and she had continually been having UTIs because of the catheter, permanent catheter and things. And she was in hospital, and this happened on and off. And they said, because of my situation with my husband, grandson, and Cheryl, they suggested this was an actual care home to start with, which was very good, I have to say, except the promise that they would have physiotherapy and things like this, but it just didn't happen, even asking why hasn't it happened. But there wasn't any availability at that time. And then she got really heartbreaking to see how much it changed her, because she couldn't do anything that she could do before. But mentally, still very, very alert. And then they suggested a care home. But from the care home, she was in and out of hospital as well. But that was mostly with UTIs, is what they were taking it in with. And then on the January of the year she died, the 28th of January, she went into hospital with supposedly a UTI again. And she was in there for 6 days on the oxygen and everything else. And then they sent her back to the nursing home. They sent her back to there. And took her off oxygen and everything and sent her home without even any oxygen.
Without any oxygen. And that was in January
2020. And that is when she's actually began to become ill, prior to her death in the April of the same year. But that is when she started to go down at that particular time.
Indeed, and you set that out in your statement that her health generally began to deteriorate at that point in January, and things unfortunately got worse.
Yes.
All the way through to April.
It had been deteriorating earlier as well, because we were looking for a rehabilitation centre. And I worked with her specialists at the particular hospital she was under, 3 of them, pain management, rheumatology, and there was another one as well. And I worked alongside them and did a lot of research to actually find a hospital who could take her. And turned down many times, but still kept going. And I actually got one, which was the University Hospital of Coventry and Warwickshire. Mm-hmm. Who agreed to take her on for rehabilitation. And we learnt that about the Christmas before her death. And she actually had got accommodation, and the whole course was getting made out for her to go in on the 18th of May. And it was too late.
Of course, sadly she was never able to undertake that.
No.
If I may ask then, just in the immediate period prior to the pandemic, when she was living in the care home and been readmitted after Christmas and January 2019, were you able to visit her? And if so, how frequently did you visit?
Well, prior to the actual pandemic, I visited her every day, sometimes twice a day. We were always... I was always there, but either husband or son or family would join anyway to come and see her. Visiting, when it was never restricted, we could actually visit from 8 in the morning till 8 in the evening. So there was never a problem with actually visiting the care home at all. No.
Thank you.
Come to the pandemic, of course, it changed.
If I could ask you then to look at what then started to take place through January through to March, so just prior to the lockdown of the care home and more broadly the restrictions in society. As news of the pandemic spread through that February and March period, did you see any changes in the care home with regard to infection prevention control or PPE?
No. And I mean, I was visiting on a daily basis, and when allowed in for visiting, there wasn't any. I mean, because we knew there was something happening, but we had hand gel and wipes and things, but there was nothing like that, or masks or anything within the actual care home sector itself. There was nothing there. When it got to the 23rd of March, when shutdown came, then, and of course, nobody was allowed to go in, we were actually told. But Cheryl was in a downstairs room that had a window, which was very fortunate because at least we could go up to the window and talk to her. But it was a matter of shouting through the window, and sometimes she'd be called and things because we're having to open the window. But there was no other ways of communicating unless I telephoned her on her mobile if there was somebody had been available to pick it up, because by this time she was having problems of she still had one arm working, but the rest wasn't, and she was having difficulty picking it up, and it was quite heartbreaking to watch because I couldn't do anything for her.
And she needed the assistance of others to help you have those conversations.
Yeah.
At that point, after the home had locked down, did you then start to see changes in terms of PPE and infection control?
No, it didn't happen. I could only see Cheryl's room because it's the only room that was visible from where we were able to see her. But definitely nothing changed. I saw staff coming in and out, nursing staff and that coming in and out. There was no PPE or anything like that with them. And on one particular day, which I was shocked about, and I'm angry about it as well, to be honest. There was a lady who did the laundry and things like this, and she came into Cheryl's room. She acknowledged Cheryl, and she went over with laundry because I always took Cheryl's laundry with me and did it at home and took it back. But because of the shutdown, I couldn't do that, so they were having to do it for her. And she walked straight into the room, acknowledged Cheryl. I can still see it happening, with this laundry and other laundry, someone else's laundry, and she went to the wardrobe and put it in. There was no PPE, there was no mask, there was nothing at all being used. It was as though it was a normal day. But Cheryl must have asked for a drink or something. And she walked straight over to Cheryl's bed. She picked up this glass, she put some water into it, took one of the straws, put it into the glass, gives it to Cheryl. Now, no way, with all this laundry and everything else, clean, dirty washing, whatever, and it was going off to somewhere else as well, more laundry, was there ever any hand washing? There was no control there whatsoever. And I was very angry when I saw that, but they didn't have it, they said.
If I can ask you about the situation when you became aware that patients were being admitted from hospital, including some with COVID.
Yes.
Were those patients separated from other residents? Were you aware as to whether or not that was happening?
Well, when I was still visiting and before lockdown, a member of staff who was quite a senior member of staff actually advised, because I'm there all the time, so I got to know them, actually advised that patients had been getting returned from the hospital because they needed beds, etc., in the hospital, and they were being returned. Now, the particular nursing home she was in was mostly on the ground floor, and it was like corridors, and there was rooms at each side of the corridor. But never up until, I don't know what happened after lockdown, but prior to that, there was never a section that was sealed off. Anyone could walk up these corridors.
Thank you. And with regard to Cheryl, at this point during the restrictions, after visiting restrictions had been put in place, did you notice any decline in her?
Oh, yes,
Herself?
Yes, because the communication wasn't as good. You know, when you couldn't sit with her, talk to her, and even this through a window was quite difficult. Sometimes she would seem depressed, she'd be tearful, but I think this was the whole situation she was in. She was just in this room, and that was it. I mean, although seeing us, but yeah, she did change, and her medication was changing, and she kept having these UTIs, and I'd say to her, she'd tell me how she feels, because I say at this time still very much alert mentally. Yeah. And she'd be telling me about the pain that she was in and what they're doing, and how she wasn't being cleaned properly, as she put it. She was not getting cleaned, which was upsetting her even more, and I couldn't do anything. If I'd have been there, I would have done it, because if I could have got into her. But I just couldn't. Try to talk to them through having to phone them up. If they answered the phone, I'd say, well, look, why is she being distressed? Why is this happening? I'm sorry, I'll look into it. But that's as far as it would go, and there would not be any comeback from it. But she continued, and she would say she was in pain. But the doctor wasn't coming up. Now, this happened prior to January, when she was actually taken in for a UTI. It happened again, and she was there 6 days, but it happened again. And they would phone the doctor, and I would speak to the nursing staff in the nursing home and say, what are they saying it is? Oh, it's a UTI. I says, how do they know? Has she been tested? Oh, no, that is what it is. And he never actually came. He sent the medications directed to the nursing home, because she wasn't under my GP anymore. She was under the nursing home, you see. So she was on this continually, but it wasn't working, and nothing else was being done.
Do you know if she was seen by a doctor at all during that period?
I think on the first occasion he said it was again another UTI. Yes, he did, and he did actually come and see her. But following that last appointment at the actual nursing home, he didn't come back. No.
And you've explained that the impact that the medication had upon Cheryl, and indeed in your statement you describe her as becoming drowsy.
Sleepy.
And because of the medication changes,
yes,
she became less able to communicate and hold those conversations. What impact did that have upon you and your attempts to communicate with her, but also James?
It affected James, and it still has very much affected her son to this date, you know, with things that will come, things that he'll say, and you know he's thinking what happened to his mum. It has still affected him. Where he was going to go into the medical profession, he'd got all his qualifications. When this happened to his mum, he said, I am not going to work, I'm not going to do that anymore, Grandma, he said. My mum got neglected. That is how and he still feels like that, as I very much do, that not so much get home, but when it comes to the hospital side, things just went haywire as well. But leading on from the nursing home, they just seemed to keep giving her pills. She was supposed to have this and she was supposed to have that. Then they started giving her Orimorph, and that got increased, which was a morphine-based drug as well. And that was because of the pain, which was supposed to be for UTIs, which I found strange.
Indeed, and James in particular found it difficult to then carry on even having that level of visiting with her.
Yes.
Because it was very difficult to communicate
He
and
couldn't
see his mum like it.
Yeah, he couldn't. And he was much younger, of course, so he didn't have that ability to communicate as well as perhaps an adult will, to try and bring it out. It was just his mum, and his mum very ill, and that did affect him, yeah.
Indeed, and you describe her as effectively almost, she just wasn't his actual mum by that point. the mum that he knew.
No, definitely, no, it wasn't, no.
If I may turn now to April, you visited Cheryl on the 19th of April. At that point, her son rather, your grandson James, was also very unwell. At this stage, you were juggling both Cheryl's needs, James's needs, and indeed your husband,
Husband
who
at
also
the
had
same
terminal cancer.
That's right.
She contacted and she told you that she was unwell. What did she say?
Mum, I feel so unwell, and she's sleepy, and she's got the pain, and then she was asked. Then she would say, "Why aren't they helping me?" I mean, this is something that would come through this as well, you know, and it would be in gasps rather than anything else. And I knew she was really unwell. Because I had been able to communicate, but for her to tell me that in such a well, she was crying as well, you know, because she didn't know what was going on.
And at that point, did you ask them to call a doctor for her?
Yes. I phoned up from outside the window when I saw it like this, and I actually phoned, and after some time they answered, and they said, "Well, it's just her UTI again," is what I kept being told. I said, "Well, look, I'm sorry, but she is deteriorating before my eyes, so why can't you see what's happening?" Anyway, so they said they would call a doctor, which, after a couple of hours of standing outside, I went home. She says, "Go home, Mum, just go and I'll come back." I said, "Okay, and I'll be back." But when I got home, I kept ringing him. "Have you called the doctor?" "No." Then, "Yes, but it's only a locum. We don't know when he's coming." I said, "Well, look, I'm sorry. We're now a couple of hours down. She needs a doctor," I said, "or an ambulance or something, because it is not the Cheryl that we all know." But they're very busy. Anyway, when it got to about 4:30, I think it was that day, I phoned up, and I'm afraid I lost it with them. I said, "You either get an ambulance now, or I am calling for that ambulance myself, because my daughter is not being cared for as she should be." And they said, "No, you won't be able to do that, because it's got to be us who sends for the ambulance. They won't come out." I said, "Well, I'm going to give you half an hour, and I want to know that there's an ambulance there. In the meantime, I've got my grandson, who's quite ill, and I'd been told by 111 to get him to a hospital, but I wasn't going to the same one as where my daughter was going. Well, eventually went to. I was going in a different direction." And anyway, when I did get back through, they had got in touch with the ambulance, and the ambulance came, and I was on the phone when the ambulance had arrived and the paramedics. And I didn't want them to go to this particular hospital. If my grandson was being sent to that one, I would have preferred her to go. But anyway, the paramedic came on the line, and she said to me, "She is very, very ill." She had gone a bit blue, her lips were blue, and her oxygen levels had dropped considerably. And she said, "We've got to blue light her into the nearest hospital."
And that's what they did. And at that point, as you say, you were with your grandson
And so I
James
was,
at a different hospital.
Yeah, and I couldn't go with, I wouldn't have been able to have gone with Cheryl anyway, because of COVID,
Of course.
basically. So I was going in the opposite direction, yeah. So she went one way and I went with James. And of course, I couldn't go into the hospital either with him when I got to the other hospital. So I waited. I said, "I'll sit in the car park, you come out." So while I was waiting for it, when I went back to the car, I looked and I saw I had a message from Cheryl herself.
Indeed, and you called Cheryl back, didn't you?
And
at
I
that
called
point?
her straight back, yeah.
You had a conversation with her.
And she was talking, she was very lucid. And she said to me, "Mum, don't speak, listen." It's difficult for her. She said, "Listen, I arrived here, and she said, the first thing that greeted me wasn't what you would expect. It was, you could die. Do you want to be resuscitated?" That was the welcome that she got when she went into that hospital. I said, "What did you say, Cheryl?" She said, "Of course, I want to be resuscitated. James is 21 next year, and I want to be in the celebrations.
Do you know if any discussions like that had taken place prior to that date? Prior to that time, no.
No.
At that point, she was admitted to the hospital. You explain in your statement that you called multiple times a day then over the next few days to try and find out what was wrong with her.
That's right.
And has she been tested for COVID? Mm-hmm. At that point, you were not told, is that right? Had no information?
No, I mean, they said, no, we haven't got that information, no, we haven't, and that was right from the 19th. And I was phoning 2 or 3 times in a day, or every 2 or 3 hours, to see how she was doing, and I'm getting told this had improved. The next day I was getting the opposite, and this is how it went on. And I asked on every occasion, have you tested her for COVID? Because I know she was not tested in the care home. She hadn't had been tested, nor had she been injected either. She hadn't had a COVID injection or anything.
Indeed, it was not until the early hours of the evening of the 23rd of April going into the 24th, when they called you at around 2:45 in the morning, that the hospital told you that she had tested positive for COVID, and moreover that she was very unwell, she was deteriorating, and that she was dying.
Yes.
And that was the first time that you've been told of that diagnosis?
Yes, and so if she had been tested on the 23rd, or if the results were there, but I was also told the results should have been there on the 21st, but I got told, and I had been asking every time I phoned, and I was never told it was COVID, because she went into a general ward when she was admitted, and then they moved her on to a high dependency ward a bit later on. So I was ringing, each time she got moved, I was ringing up to find out, and it was just rather chaotic, to be honest, altogether.
She was very unwell at that stage, and the hospital told you that her kidneys were failing. Mm-hmm. Were they going to provide further treatment, or was it effectively palliative care for end of life?
Yes, it was palliative care. Because it's only, as I say, going through the notes, even from the hospital, which I've gone over again and again to see if there's anything. From the day of admission, when she first went into this first particular ward, and they actually took her case before the care team, the ITU care team, and the questions that were asked, was she suitable for ventilation? No. To every single thing, even right down to renal interaction, which I don't know why that came into it. And it all been ticked off as no.
And how did that make you feel at the time?
Well, devastated, absolutely devastated. Why if she's getting treated for UTIs, all of a sudden she can't have anything done, nothing at all. When I'm getting told that there's no evidence yet of COVID, any test results, why can they say no to everything when they haven't had any results back?
And you were you explain in your statement you were very angry at the time.
I was angry when that doctor rang me 2:45 in the morning, because I'd spoken to her. I was angry and I was upset. In fact, I was very angry when she told me my daughter was dying. And unfortunately, I absolutely screamed down the phone, because it's how I felt, and I still feel it to this day, that she had got dumped on the scrap heap because of her disabilities, and that is how I really feel about it.
And Cheryl ended up being moved, as you say, to a respiratory ward.
Yes.
You were able to speak to her at that stage.
Yes, more limited than what I was at the home. I mean, the nursing staff were exceptionally good. They would take the phone to her, because at this now she couldn't lift her mobile at all, but they would take a phone and I could talk to her. But she was more listening to us, talking to her, than her explaining too much to me. I mean, she couldn't tell me about I've only found all this out on the notes, where the hoods were collapsing, where they were finding things wrong. with the oxygen going in, and they had found leaks and she wasn't getting it, and she'd been crying out because the oxygen wasn't going in. So it was just a horrendous time. It really was.
I won't read it out, but in your statement you describe the trauma that she faced
Oh, definitely.
in relation to those issues in her last
Yes.
days.
Yes.
If I may move a couple of days ahead to the 27th of April, you were out at that point collecting James when you received a phone call from the hospital to say that Cheryl was dying.
Yes.
This is another time when you were contacted in
That's
that regard.
right.
You returned immediately home, and when you arrived home, your husband was waiting at the front door for you with Cheryl on the telephone. Were you able to speak to her?
Yes. Yes, I was able. She didn't respond in any way, but it gave us some comfort, the fact that I'm hoping she heard us talking to her, because my husband spoke to her and I did. And so did James started to speak to tell her how much he loved her, but he couldn't. He completely broken down. So it was a matter of trying to keep strong for his sake, really, because I felt like doing the same, because I couldn't believe it was happening.
Indeed. And sadly, Cheryl died when you were on the telephone to
Yes.
her.
Yeah.
She was only 50 years old.
Yes.
In terms of the communication and contact that you had with Cheryl prior to her death, you found out afterwards that the hospital had said that you could go and see her at that point. Your husband had not told you. You say you think that was to protect you. But I think it's right to say that you've also because practically you just would not have got there in time.
I wouldn't, because when I was speaking to them, it was only 10 minutes later she died, and I couldn't. The hospital was about 15 miles away, so I couldn't have made it anyway. But I hadn't been told even during the day that she was actually, even when I was speaking to doctors, because even the day before I was told she'd improved slightly. So and this was after the phone call to say that she was dying, I was told that she'd slightly improved the following day. During speaking to a nurse, and of course that gives you that hope again, but it was dashed pretty quickly.
Indeed. You subsequently received Cheryl's medical notes and records, and you
That took a bit of doing as well, because I wanted the hospital records, and I wasn't. Well, I asked first of all, to be honest, for the nursing home to give me the records. They outrightly refused me having the records, and I said, why? They said, there are too many there. It would cost us a fortune to get these photocopied. I said, well, I will photocopy them, or I'll pay you and if I can have her medical notes, because I was really concerned about this UTI business and everything else that was going on, and I wanted to see how it had been documented. And they completely refused. And to this date, I have never been able to get her medical records. Going on to the hospital, I asked for them, and they weren't forthcoming for some time. Well, in the end, I got in touch with my MP at that time, who was exceptionally good, and he contacted the hospital, and I did get them. I know it took a little while to come through, but I did have a couple of boxes of records, of all our hospital records delivered. But that was through, I think, him intervening, because he did contact me to say what he had done. And he had done it, because you were at that stage where you weren't believing what any politician was telling you. So now I've got someone telling me, yeah, I'll do this. But, you know, credit where credit's due, he did do that.
Indeed, but it's right to say that that was particularly difficult for you, because
yeah.
it opened up all sorts of other issues, and
you learn a lot more than what you knew before, and that's been a continual thing, really. That hasn't gone away. You know, it hasn't gone away at all. Not for me or any of the family. It just hasn't.
The funeral that was subsequently held was subject, obviously, to the restrictions that were in place at that time. And you held a cremation with 6 people present.
Yes.
How has that impacted you and your family's ability to grieve for Cheryl?
Dreadful, really. It was. Because she deserved so much more than that. I know it was restrictions. We had to abide by the rules. You know, this is what it was. But it felt, for the girl she was and the lady she became, it was devastating to all of us to have just 6 people there. And she was cremated. But then James said, Mum, I want Mum's ashes to be buried. So we bought a burial plot in our local cemetery. And we had her buried. But of course, from when she died on the 27th, she wasn't of April. She wasn't cremated until towards the end of May, and then we couldn't get her buried till 23rd of July. So that period in itself, what could we do? We just couldn't have anything done. But we were actually allowed, by July, we were allowed 9 people. But that is nothing to what she should have had, nothing at all.
You subsequently joined COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. And why did you do that?
Well, I was watching people's story. I mean, I only lost my daughter. I say only lost. That was the biggest, it was a very big event. But so many people lost other people, and so many people had been suffering, and some had got saved. And I thought, it's only if people speak out about what's happened that I believe that in the future things should be and will be different. And I felt that perhaps this inquiry would enable things to progress. As whatever government, whoever's in charge, should actually move this along to make sure this never happens to anyone again, because it does destroy your life. It's not the same life that we all had before. So different to what it was when your loved ones were with you.
Indeed. And you explained finally in your statement that telling Cheryl's story to the inquiry is very important to you.
Oh, yes, yes.
She is then a part of this inquiry, and it will go some way to cementing her legacy. Is there anything else that you'd wish to tell the inquiry or for my lady to hear?
No, it was just... With Cheryl, she'd be wanting to help. She would want to help people. She was that type of girl. She danced all over the country. She sang. She was in school choirs, and she was in the church choir, sang in Ely Cathedral. And very much a Christian person is the only way I can put it. She was a Christian. She helped out with Brownie's Guides, did everything, And she would want me to make sure nobody else would suffer like and she did suffer. There's no two ways about it, and she didn't deserve that at all, because she was just my daughter, but I can say it, she was just so good, and a pleasure to have had, and miss her a lot, definitely, which we all do, definitely always will miss her. But it was just Cheryl, so much you could say, but
Thank you, Mrs. Dinsdale.
Okay.
I have no further questions, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed. You've been through so much and you talk about it so calmly, but I bet inside I was going to say, are you like a swan with the legs going underneath?
Very much so. Yes.
I mean, you've lost your beloved daughter, you thought you were losing your grandson, and you lost your beloved husband.
And I lost him last year.
But
actually, yes.
You've been through so much, and thank you for sharing your story with us. And I promise you there'll be a mention in my inquiry report of the bereaved generally, and where I can, obviously a mention of individual bereaved.
Thank you
to
very
cement
much.
a legacy.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think somebody will be coming to see you.
Right, okay. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Miss Hudson.
Thank you. It's okay.
Indeed, my lady. May I call Gregory McQuitty?
I'd like to repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and nothing but the truth.
Ms McQuitty, thank you for coming to help us. I hope we haven't kept you waiting.
No, my lady, you haven't. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McQuitty. You are here today to share your father, Ivor's, experience and your experiences during the pandemic. Sadly, your father passed away on the 2nd of May of 2020 at the age of 84.
That's correct.
He was a man that you very powerfully describe in your witness statement as being a man who loved intensely and was very much loved. How would you describe him in your own words?
He's
Emily?
sorry.
Don't worry, take your time, Mr. McQuitty. Sometimes having a sip of water can help. I suggest we don't break because I think it might be better for you if we got on with it.
He was the best man ever I knew. He was honest and very, very hard working. But as well, every son tries to model herself on their fathers and just. But because of the situation, the way it happened in the COVID, I've never really talked about this before, you know.
Of course.
But
Mr. McQuitty, maybe I can help you a little bit in terms of your dad. You obviously have a large family.
yes,
He was very much a central part of that family in terms of both you, your siblings, his children, effectively, and his grandchildren, and the wider family also.
that's correct.
Very active within all of those. He was also a very active man because, of course, up until 2019, he remained living independently in his own home.
Yes,
It was only as a consequence of some falls resulting in him going into hospital that he then returned and effectively moved into a residential care home. His needs were such that was what was necessary at the time. He had Alzheimer's and dementia. He was also deaf at this point in both ears and using hearing aids.
yes,
And so he had a number of needs, and those were accommodated by the home. He lived in a dementia wing.
that's correct.
In terms of choosing that home, one of the most important things for you and your family, as I understand it, was that it was a close home to you, so that you could go and visit.
The
Did
home
you?
closed. I think it was the same as the rest of them. There was no warning or nothing. We went to see him one day and there was a sign on the home door saying it was closed to visits.
Let me just go back one step with you, Mr. McQuitty. It's my question that's confused you. I was saying you chose the home that he went to live in because it was close to you and your family, and so you were able to visit frequently because it was initially when he first moved in just down the road from where your sister lived
Yes,
and
it
where
was
you
only-
lived.
Yes, it was only a mile from my sister's house, and the home at that time hadn't a great reputation. And some of the family didn't want my father going there. There was a lot of questions in the home about cleanliness, etc., and meals, etc., as it's well advertised in the media, but it was close. I say it was a mile from my sister's house, and my father's house was only up the road. It was in the same vicinity, and yeah, that's why he was there, because if we hadn't got him that home, close to home, it could have been Antrim, Armagh, Newry, just wherever a bed come up, you know, so we had got him close to home.
And you were able to stop, so you often stopped in when you were passing by.
Yes, yes, we caught in whenever we could.
And did you also take him out on trips?
We took him out for what we call fish suppers at home, and I enjoyed it so much. And it was sitting, the sort of, when you end the first thing he done, it was the Gramwains. We took the Gramwains up, they just loved him, and he loved them.
And although he had Alzheimer's and dementia, actually, he was still able to recognise you.
He still knew who everybody was, yeah.
Indeed. And you explained that one of the ways in which he expressed his love for his grandchildren, and indeed more generally the family, was through hugs, through
That's
physical
correct.
contact.
Yeah. You got them and entering and exiting, you got hugs, and that was it. Yeah.
And you touched on this already, but of course things changed quite significantly when the pandemic struck
Yes.
and you were no longer able to visit. You explained a moment ago that the care home was locked down with no notice. How did you find out that the care home was closing so that you could no longer visit?
A sign on the door, just on the glass door.
Had you gone to visit on that
Yes,
occasion?
we went to visit. We were up checking around my father's home because that was vacant. We hadn't been in the home. And as I say, that was passing anyway, but we caught down and there was just a sign on the door. No explanation, no, no phone messages, no emails, nothing.
And were you ever able to see your father again after that day?
No.
Was there any opportunity to try to speak to him using other forms of communication, or was that just too difficult because of his needs?
It would have been too difficult because whenever we went to see my father on a visit, there was grandchildren. You were either taking him out of the home for something to eat or even to run to the seaside, Every time he seen you, he was either getting something or took somewhere. Actually, whenever you went in, he was reaching for his shoes and you had to say, oh no, we're not going today, he thought. But if you drive into the home, my father's bedroom was the window, you drive by it. So we could see him at any time. But I wasn't going to a window to see my father.
I know you were concerned that if he saw you, it would cause a lot of distress and upset.
He would have been expecting something, at that time.
That was a very difficult decision, obviously, to
Yeah.
make. Did the home, and you further explained that phone calls would not work because of his deafness,
He had a hearing aid in both ears, correct, yes.
and similarly video calls would not work because of the confusion and his other health issues.
That's correct.
Did the home separately provide you with any information about how they were going to deal with the pandemic?
No.
Did they provide you with any information about isolation or access to communal areas, or how your father was living at that stage?
The only time my father took to hospital, he had a fall out of bed. And they contacted me to say that he was obviously in hospital. And then it was released again. But whenever I contacted the home to see how my father was, they said he was in the TV room and he was happy enough.
And in terms of the TV room, that's when he came back out. You explained he was taken into hospital, then he came back out and was
Yes.
in the TV room.
Uh-huh.
Was it possible to socially distance in that room?
Very, very small room. It would have been extremely hard.
You explained in your statement that there was no testing, there was no isolation upon his return to the home from hospital.
That's correct.
Did you know why he went to the hospital at that point?
He had a fall. But the falls, as it says on my statement, I've got my father's medical records just to clear my own for dates, etc. And I had 16 on witness falls. And the home was supposed to ring you in an emergency if I went to hospital.
Did they contact you on any of those occasions?
They contacted me 4 times. And on the medical records, he attended accident and emergency, 19.
And that you explained that it was very, very difficult for you to read those medical records when you
Yes.
subsequently did.
Very hard reading.
Indeed. You had very little communication from the home generally. You set that out within your statement, but you were fortunate in that you did know some people who worked there, and so you had some informal lines of communication in relation to that. Were you able to get some updates in relation to your dad in that way?
Yes, I had a niece worked on it, and my friend's sister was actually, she was the manager in it. And she kept us informed. Any sort of tidbits we got, that's where it come from. Because they loved my father. My father never got into any trouble. There was no,
And more generally, in terms of updates on your father's health, did the home keep in contact with you, or was it very much the burden upon you to contact them to see how he was doing every day?
You had to contact them. There was no effort from the home at all.
Now, throughout that period, are you aware if there was any COVID testing for staff or for the residents?
No, none at all. And that come from the niece and the manager home, whose son actually caught it, and my niece caught it.
Thank you. If I can go then, please, to touch upon when he was, just after he was discharged from the hospital. You've explained that he was initially, he'd been taken to hospital on a number of occasions, but on one particular occasion he was taken to the hospital but then subsequently discharged back to the home, and you've explained about him being in that communal area. Following on from that, the next contact that you had from the home, as I understand it, was around the 19th of April.
Yes,
You were told at that point that he was unwell.
he was unwell, yes.
And what did they say in relation to why, in relation to his condition, or why he was unwell at that
He was not getting any better. He had a sore throat. And now they didn't tell me this, I got it from the medical writers, that they said he had a swollen throat. The medical writer says he had a thing on his neck, the size of a tennis ball. Now that wasn't relayed to me from the home.
But they told you that they were sending him at that point to the hospital, is
Yes.
that right?
That's correct.
And it was when he got to the hospital that you found out that he had COVID.
Yes, the ward sister phoned me.
Up until that point, were there any cases of COVID in the home that you were aware of?
No.
You explained that you called the home to inform the home that your dad had COVID.
Yes.
What did they tell you that they were doing at that stage?
Well, it was from my niece and the manager, it was obvious that it seemed to be kicked in then, that the COVID thing, the PPE and all come out, where they had it, or because there was no PPE in the home, they maybe didn't have to use it. But the minute that COVID was announced, you know, they did step up now.
Indeed, and that's when you explained that they were putting in place emergency preparations and, as
Yeah.
you say, using
Yeah.
PPE. And following that point, the home had quite a significant outbreak with staff
correct.
and residents.
Yes.
Did the home contact you again after your father was admitted to hospital?
No.
Sadly, your father was to remain in hospital until he passed away. He passed away on the 2nd of May.
Yes,
The
that's
hospital
correct.
contacted you to tell you that.
Yes.
You explain in your statement you do not really know the circumstances of his death or the treatment that he received.
No, not a thing. I was listening to the professor earlier, and he said about the CPR. On my father's death certificate, it took us a long while to receive it. COVID was first, with heart failure second. And we don't know now, did his heart stop? Did his heart failure kill him? Did the DCPR? Did the COVID kill him? There's so many unanswered questions, just don't know.
Indeed, every layer or engagement that you have brings something new to the front again for you.
Yeah.
In terms of his condition in the hospital, were you told that he was deteriorating or given the opportunity to see or speak to him before he died?
I think possibly the sister might have done iPad, but, you know, mask and all on, a hearing aid in each ear, dementia and Alzheimer's also, the chances, it just didn't work,
Just didn't work.
you know.
You explained that the hospital and the undertaker took care of the funeral arrangements, and you
Yes.
this was obviously again at a point where various restrictions were in place. They told you when it would be, and organised that. How many people were able to attend,
11.
and how was it conducted?
Very clinical. It was unlike anything anybody had ever seen, the same as everybody else. You pick a cough and you get their suit or whatever. There was nothing. We were simply told, we weren't told, we went to the undertakers and followed the hearse out. We were told to be at the graveyard. But we thought, well, shouldn't up and sat outside the undertakers, but it was nothing near normal. Not a thing about it was normal, really.
You explain in your witness statement that they were able to bend some of the rules a little bit for you.
Well,
In re-
aye, we got carrying him. We carried him about 10 metres.
And how did that impact upon your ability to grieve for your father and to certainly, obviously, it was not the normal way that you would undertake any of these proceedings. So you explained there would normally be a funeral, there would normally be a wake. What impact did that have upon you and your family?
It's unbelievable. You know, there was nothing whatsoever. Even the police was out on the roads. You weren't to be travelling at that stage. There was a whole complete lockdown, so you couldn't go to anybody's house before or after. There was no wake. There was no stories for the grandkids. There was no. No, and everybody just had to go home. The minute the funeral minister had finished the service, there was no handshakes, nothing. Everybody just dispersed, you know. It was just shocking. Just left everything. It was like a open book. The book was never closed.
And since your father's death, you've also sought to bring wider awareness to the position of both your family but also others during the pandemic. Can you explain that you wrote to Robin Swan 3 times?
3 times.
Did you ever get a response?
Email and never even got an acknowledgement, never mind a reply.
And it's obviously important for you that you share your story, but also, most importantly of all, your father's story.
Yes.
It's important that the inquiry has heard that today. Is there anything else that you would wish the inquiry or my lady to hear?
Well, I would like to thank everybody for giving me the opportunity. And any son that would get a chance, you know, he needs to do it.
Thank you very
Sure.
much. No, thank you, Mr. McQuitty. Thank you, my lady.
Mr. McQuitty, I do understand. If this is the first time you've spoken about it, to do so in public is
That's it.
extraordinarily brave.
I'm nervous.
And you survived. And I hope you haven't found it too distressing.
Not too.
But it's not at all surprising.
No.
Obviously, your grief is going to come out as you talk
Yeah.
about it. So thank you very much indeed for all that you've done to help the inquiry and for coming over from Northern Ireland. I don't know if there's any consolation, but just think how your father benefited from such a close and loving family.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you. Oh, I think the plan is to go on. Somebody will come and talk to you. Ms. McQuitty.
My lady, yes. Will just be a moment while we bring in the next witness, Mrs. Rona Arthur. Can I have it? My lady, may I call, please, Mrs. Rona Arthur?
After me, please. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please don't say.
So I hope coming at the end of our witnesses hasn't been too difficult for you.
No, not at all.
Have you been following the other evidence?
Absolutely, and the previous weeks of the inquiry as well.
It's not been too tough for you?
No, but it's been a long 5 weeks for everybody.
Yes, it has. It's Kerry.
Thank you. Mrs. Arthur, your full name, please.
Rona Elizabeth Arthur.
You are our final witness at
I
the
am.
conclusion of these proceedings, and I'd like to ask you some questions, please, about the death of your mother and father back in May 2020. Is this right, that your dad, William, known as Billy, I think, died on the 3rd of May 2020, aged 90?
That's correct. He was
And-
just a couple of weeks short of his 91st birthday.
Yes. And your mum, Violet, died just 17 days later,
She did.
on the 20th of May, when she was aged 93.
That's correct.
And they had been together, I think, for 69 years
They had.
and married just shy of 65
That's-
years.
That's correct.
Both born in Belfast, is that right?
Absolutely.
But by mid-1970s, they moved to Scotland
Yep,
and they brought up you and your 2 siblings
they did.
and 5 grandchildren and
Correct.
2 great-grandchildren.
Yes, they were very heavily involved with their grandchildren, so they had been involved in terms of their upbringing as well.
Clearly, by 2020, a life well lived and long lived. Your mum, though, had begun to develop vascular dementia in her late 80s, is that right? And your dad looked after her for a long time.
That's right.
But he also had some ailments, and there came a point where I think your mum had to go into a local care home first of all. Is that correct?
Yes, she had been in hospital towards the end of 2017 and had a number of difficult medical issues from which we really didn't think she would recover. And when she was discharged from hospital, she went into a nursing home nearby my dad, so about 20 miles from me. So that she could have some rehabilitation, but we didn't ever think that it was fair to my dad that she should go home again, because it was more of a strain on his health than I think we'd previously appreciated.
And there came a point, though, that your dad then also joined your mum.
They were devoted to each other. They were a pair of bookends, and one was not very helpful without the other. So he chose to move into the nursing home beside her.
Can you just help us with the nursing home? You say it's newly purpose-built. Did they have a room each? What were the arrangements for them to be with each other?
So there was 4 wings. It was a new build, so it was opened up wing by wing. When my mum first entered, she was in the second wing to open up. And my dad secured a room opposite hers in a corridor. So I think there were 12 residents in their wing, and they had a shared lounge and a shared dining room within that wing. But it was a cohort, if you like, a natural cohort. They were on the first floor as well.
And when not spending time with your mother, I think you said in your statement that your dad spent his time in the greenhouse and doing various activities. Can you just tell us what he would do sort of on a day-to-day basis?
So my dad was a great community kind of person. So there wasn't a club or a society that he wasn't president, secretary or treasurer of. And he really enjoyed people. He moved into the nursing home and spotted the empty greenhouse. He had been a passionate gardener. And of course, within 5 minutes, he was getting shelving in and growing tomatoes. And then he had the nursery school children coming in, and they were taught how to grow things as well. So he was very active. He would get the keyboard out and play that in the lounge for people, Christmas carols, that kind of thing. So,
can you give us a sense of your experience of the care that your mum and dad experienced in the care home? What did you think it was like for them?
So when my mum came out of hospital, she was really frail. She was really poorly. She had been in hospital at that stage for about 8 or 10 weeks. And she was suffering from sometimes dehydration, lack of nutrition. So getting into a proper routine where she was helped to take more fluids during the day, to eat more healthily. We noticed even things like her hair changed. It began to really shine again, and her health picked up. She also became slightly more mobile for a while. And of course, my dad was just spoilt by all the staff because he was there all the time. And again, he was very lively and communicative. So he really interacted very well with the staff. They then would just take the rest of the visitors and sort of wrap them into the kind of the community life that went on in the care home.
I think you say in your statement that loving care was the norm.
It was.
When we move, though, to March 2020, and you say in your statement that the care home, initially on the 6th of March, sent out a letter as a precautionary measure, halting all non-essential visits.
Yes.
So they did that a little bit earlier than everyone going into lockdown. And then on the 12th of March, they wrote again announcing a lockdown unless the resident needed medical treatment. And then by the end of the month, on the 26th, there was a general ban on visits unless exceptional circumstances were permitted. So can I ask you, Mrs. Arthur, how did you communicate with your mum and dad once the various restrictions came in?
So once the restrictions came in, normally I would have gone to visit on at least a weekly basis. But my dad would, he was quite digitally aware, so he would be able to FaceTime, he'd be able to include my mum with FaceTime calls. For practical reasons, I mentioned earlier that they were on the first floor, so any visits that I would make, window visits, weren't really feasible when you're one flight up and you can't move across the care home, because then you would be going into somebody else's space. So the only alternative would be to stand in the car park and to shout up to their balcony. So it was really down to FaceTime or telephone calls, which worked very well with my mother.
That's what I was going to ask you about, because with her particular cognitive difficulties, how was communication with her sort of by remote methods? Was she okay with it?
Yeah, so although my mum had vascular dementia, she was not severely affected by it. She just lived in the moment. So you couldn't ask her what she'd had for breakfast, but she could appreciate everything that was going on round about her, as long as you were asking her about things that she could see and talk about. So she was a bit hard of hearing, so she had a telephone pressed up against her ear she could hear, and she could certainly understand.
Did you, on the video calls and the balcony visits, if I may call them that, did you see whether the staff were wearing PPE at this time?
So the staff, prior to COVID, would have worn uniforms, and you could kind of tell from the uniform whether they were part of the domestic staff, whether they were a carer, whether they were a registered nurse. But once the restrictions came in, they quite clearly started to wear gloves that they might have used previously. Maybe if they were working directly with somebody, that became the norm. They had quite often visors and face masks and aprons.
Were you ever told of any shortage of PPE at the care home or have any concerns of that nature?
I wasn't aware of any shortages of PPE, and we were assured in all the written communications, which were pretty regular, that all the IPC measures were in place, and there was a great emphasis on hand washing, for instance, and social distancing.
And I think you set out in your statement that indeed, and by the 7th of May, the care home had started asymptomatic testing. Can I just take one stage back? Sure. You mention in your statement that there was some anticipatory care discussions with your father. And I think you said that your dad was adamant that he didn't want to put anyone at risk from your family of going to visit him.
Yes.
Right.
My dad was quite aware that COVID was coming from quite early on, because he was still very active. He was still trading his stocks and shares, so he was looking at this advancing crisis and thinking about how that would affect things. And we had a fairly lengthy discussion about what would happen. He had said that he was aware that any funerals would not be normal, that might not be possible. He asked that nobody should be put at any additional risk, and that if it was possible, in the fullness of time, that we would have a memorial service for him.
So rather than people bringing in the infection, he didn't want the infection creeping out. And in that regard, I think you say in your statement that the families, in fact, got a letter from the care home at the beginning of April when the care home was considering taking patients that had been discharged from hospitals, and they said they had in place screening processes to ensure that no one who was symptomatic would be admitted to the home. Did you know what those screening processes were?
No, I don't think the letter actually explains that. I would have taken it to be anybody who was displaying the key kind of COVID characteristics, the cough, the raised temperature, that kind of thing. And
I think you say that some of the families were not particularly happy with that letter. And within 48 hours, the care home, in fact, then changed its policy to saying there would be no admissions from hospital, or indeed readmissions from hospital, unless the individual had actually got a negative COVID test.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, can I come to your father firstly, please, if I may? I think you were told on the 25th of April that he had a slight temperature, and it was a few days later on the 30th that he got his test result back, which was COVID positive.
That's correct.
And were you able to speak to him on the daily calls
Yes.
at
Yes.
that time?
Yeah, we were all in touch with him, my brothers as well, and he was still actively emailing and messaging as well. So he was just, I would describe it as a little under the weather in those early days.
Did you know whether he'd actually, since the end of February or the beginning of March, had he actually been out of the home into the community?
No, he hadn't. He wasn't. He could get as far as the greenhouse. He had a quite a significant physical mobility issue, so he could get as far as the greenhouse, but only if he went the direct route. If he walked round the care home to go in the far gate, that would be a long walk for him. But he couldn't so much as cross the road.
No. So does it follow that, from your perspective, the infection must have come to him rather
Absolutely.
than him leaving the care home and getting it out of the
Absolutely.
community? All right. And I think a GP was called for your dad on the 30th. The GP came to visit him in the care home and suggested that your dad go to the hospital because they thought it would help your dad with his breathing.
That's correct.
And can I just ask you then a little bit about what happened to your dad in hospital? I think you say you spoke to him that afternoon.
I did.
And how did he seem when you spoke to him?
I phoned him. No, he phoned me, and he said they thought he was doing quite well, coping quite well, that he didn't need oxygen at that stage, and he was in a room by himself, and he felt quite kind of comfortable. I think he was reassured that he was in the city hospital.
Yeah. And then just a few hours later, I think 3 hours later, though, you got a call from the hospital doctor who wanted to discuss with you a do not resuscitate notice. Just help us. How did that conversation develop?
So the doctor had phoned and had explained, what they were doing in terms of treatment, and had said that they wanted to discuss a DNA CPR. Now, I explained earlier that my mother had been in hospital a couple of years prior to that. And we had a DNA CPR discussion, the whole family, the doctor, and at that point, I know my father was really quite distressed at the thought of the impact of a DNA CPR on my mother. So it was his choice to have that notice, according to the doctor, and of course the family supported his decision.
But very shortly after that, about 3 hours later, I think were you informed that your father had rapidly deteriorated, and in fact the doctors were worried that he was not going to survive the night.
Yeah, they said he would not survive the night.
He did, though, for a few days.
He did.
But sadly died on the 3rd of May.
He did.
And I think you were allowed to spend some time with your father after he died.
That's correct.
Can you help it? Were you able to sit with him? Were you allowed to touch him? Were you wearing PPE?
So the hospital had made PPE available for me, and let me go in and sit with him for as long as I wanted to do that.
Yeah. And COVID-19 was given as the primary cause of death on your father's death certificate.
That's correct.
May I ask you about your mum, though?
Can.
Because clearly she was in the care home, and you've told us about her cognitive abilities. Were you able to break it to your mum that her husband had died?
Yes, my mother was my first thought, because obviously her loss was the most significant. And I really had no other option other than to use the telephone. I had spoken to the manageress in the nursing home, and the staff, because they were so fond of my parents, a member of staff had volunteered to sit with her and to provide that emotional support. And that's a burden for anybody to have to do. And similarly with my dad, the hospital staff fielded the end of life calls from 3 of us as well. So I think there's an enormous debt of gratitude that we owe them.
Understandably, your mum understood what had happened to your dad, and I think you say that there was a decline really in how she was ever since she got the news.
Yeah.
You were then making funeral arrangements for your father, trying to help your mother with her grief, and though she tested positive on the 9th of May, and I think you'd arranged your father's funeral for the 18th of May, and you say in your statement that as you were going into the crematorium, you got a call from the care home about your mum. What did they tell you about your mother?
They said at that time that her health was giving them cause for concern. In the intervening period, she had just lost heart and became quite withdrawn and spending a lot more time in bed than would have been her norm. Her norm every day would be to be up and to be in the residence lounge and mixing with people. So it was quite unusual, that. And we weren't really sure if it was grief or if it was COVID. But equally, she didn't have any symptoms. Yeah. So although she tested positive and had been exposed since at least the 25th of April, even by the middle of May, she wasn't showing any of the key symptoms.
And you and your brothers were phoning her up and singing to her down the phone and no doubt trying to keep her spirits up as best you could. The funeral was presumably under restrictions with very few family. How many of you were there?
Until about 2 days beforehand, I was determined that it would just be me. But my husband persuaded me that this was one household going to one place and that it would be a good idea. So there was 3 of us, my husband, my son, and myself at his funeral.
And then just, I think, 2 days later, you got a call from the care home to say that your mum's oxygen levels had dropped and they were clearly worried about her. Were you offered an end-of-life visit to go and see your mum?
I was, and I paused to tell my husband and my son and my daughter, who doesn't live with us, and my brothers. And by that stage, the care home phoned back to say that they had discovered that she had died during one of the rounds.
Yeah, within half an hour or 35 minutes or so?
Less than that, probably.
Right. And I think your mum's death certificate noted COVID-19 as the primary cause of death.
Yes.
As well. And so another funeral to arrange, Mrs. Arthur. This time, were you still limited with the numbers? It's just a couple of weeks later.
The restrictions in Scotland, the travel restrictions had just changed, which meant that my daughter could travel across from another part of Scotland and go to her grandmother's funeral. So we sat in an empty crematorium, the 4 of us, and with my daughter the far side of the crematorium at the funeral.
Can I ask you this? You say in your statement that the day that your mum died was the day that in the press there were photos of the drinks party at Downing Street. How did that make you and your family feel, having just lost now your other parent and seeing photos like that?
Yeah, it was. It just felt so cruel, you know, that we had done all the right things, that we had followed all the rules down to the funerals, to then see that. And of course, that picture is regularly reprinted, which means that it just brings that terrible day back all the time.
Before I look at the impact with on you and your family, did you get any sense of the impact of the death of both of your parents on the care home staff and how they felt about it?
Yeah, the care home staff, obviously I had to go back to pick up the things from their rooms. And and there were a number of kind of informal conversations. They had been very fond of my parents. They had a number of deaths, and as the Public Health Scotland data that was published on the 1st of October in 2021 gives you the idea of how many died within a very short space of time, many from the wing of the care home that they were in, so friends and colleagues. And I think certainly they said when my mother died that it had an extreme impact on staff. Of the fact that I think she was such a gentle woman, and that it was such a terrible thing to lose her husband and then to go through that suffering herself.
And the impact on you and your family, are you able to just summarise, if at all it's possible to summarise it, how you feel now?
For a long time I described it as being like a house with the roof ripped off, because that's just that kind of idea about how empty and devastating a double loss is. It's very difficult to talk to people about. People say, oh, what happened to you during COVID? You cannot just say to somebody, well, actually, both my parents died within a fortnight. It's a complete and utter devastating blow in a conversation. So it's better just maybe not to talk too much about these things.
I think one of the things you did say, and I wanted to just finally ask you about this, you said the passing has left a massive hole in my family's lives. It's important the inquiry understands that my family did not lose a burden that was weighing us down. We lost two wonderful advisors, guides and experts who connected us to each other and to our culture, heritage and past. Why did you want to make that point to us, Mrs. Arthur?
So my father particularly was still economically active, as was my mother. I think there's a subtle ageism in our society, and sometimes not so subtle, where there's a vision of care homes as being places where people are shut away to live out their days forgotten about, sleeping off in a chair, and it doesn't have to be like that. We were always part of the care home family, and my parents were still fulfilling useful roles in society as well as within their own community in the care home. So I was very keen, and I think there's also something about there were things that I would only talk to my mum and dad about, that are cultural, that are heritage, that you would share with somebody. Like, I probably wouldn't sit down with anybody else and talk about a piece of music the way I would with my dad, or, point holes in the minister's sermon, which we regularly did on a Sunday afternoon.
Mrs. Arthur, they are all the questions I wanted to ask you. Is there anything that else you would like to say before I turn to her ladyship?
I think the only thing I would like to say really is about the care homes and this idea that that they should have been equipped to enact the guidance. We know that there was so much lacking in terms of PPE, in terms of testing. It was an almost impossible task that they were given, to take those hospital discharges. We still got questions about the human rights issues that surround that. So I think there's still quite a lot of important work to do for the inquiry. So thank you very much.
Challenge noted.
Yes. Right.
Thank you very much indeed for coming along to help us. Have you come from Scotland today?
No, yesterday.
Yesterday. It doesn't matter how old one is or how old one's parents are, to lose one parent is horrible. So for you to lose two in such a short space of time must have been truly horrendous for you. And then not to be able to grieve in the way that we would normally grieve. So thank you very much indeed for telling us about your wonderful parents
Thank
I
you.
bet the staff at the care home miss those tomatoes.
I bet they do.
I know I would. Anyway, thank you so much for coming along and for giving us your help.
Thank you.
Very well, I think we're now on to closing
Closing, we
submissions.
are.
That completes the evidence for this module.
It does.
And I shall return at 3:15? 3:15.
Thank you, my lady.
Someone will come and talk to you, Mrs. Arthur, I'm sure. Ms. Morris, I'm sorry that you and Ms. Campbell and Mr. Stanton are having to make your closing submissions after such a powerful day of evidence, but anyway, thank you.
My lady, it has been a difficult day, particularly for the bereaved families, but I'm grateful for
I
that recognition. Thank you. My lady, on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, I make the following submissions in closing in Module 6. The inquiry has heard across the last 18 days of evidence that before the pandemic, the social care sector was poorly understood, poorly funded, poorly represented within and poorly engaged by government. This was nothing new to those working in or caring for people in the sector. Its fragility was well known. But what the inquiry has uncovered is that not only is the situation no better than at the start of the pandemic, but in fact, it is worse. My lady, reform will not wait for another winter. Baroness Casey's commission will not complete phase 1 of its work until 2026, but work on reform is long overdue and needs to start now. The inquiry must engage with and make recommendations on key structural issues underpinning the failures of government to throw a protective ring around the care sector, those who were and continue to be the most vulnerable to the impact of a pandemic. The focus in your report, my lady, must not be on rhetoric, but on recommendations. So to this end, I'll use my time in addressing you to identify key recommendations that the bereaved families that I represent are clear must be made and must be implemented to ensure that the adult social care sector, a vital pillar of our communities, our families, is both robust and able to safely and compassionately provide the care that people need, even in the next pandemic. So my first area of recommendations is on the issue of parity. The first problem is in conceptualising health and social care as separate needs for any given person. For those with care needs, there is no optimum health without adequate social care. There have long been seen as separate and competing service interests within government. Social care should not be the Cinderella service or poor relative to health services. It needs to be recognised as one system for supporting people holistically with their needs. As Professor Rayner said, there is a need to recognise the importance and expertise of social care as equal partners to healthcare providers. This lack of parity continues to manifest itself through insufficient resources, insufficient wages, and insufficient IPC measures. The position is even worse for domiciliary care providers and unpaid carers, and the tireless work that they do still barely receives a mention in government policy considerations. This lack of parity is exemplified by two important pandemic examples on the evidence before the inquiry. First, it is clear from Helen Whately's evidence that the March 2020 policy of discharging untested patients to care homes was an example of the needs of the NHS taking precedence over social care. The leaders in the NHS England were focused on what they needed to do to, quote, protect the NHS. Mrs. Whately didn't see them being concerned for what that would mean for social care. The discharge of untested patients from hospitals into care homes without adequate isolation facilities must never happen again. Whether discharge was the dominant route is a distraction. It was a route and it cost lives. Mrs. Whately rejected the certainty of the UK government position on the impact of the policy, which, as the inquiry has established, is undermined by the lack of testing in the key period that the policy operated within. The second example is the inadequate provision of PPE to care workers across the sector. Responses to the LGA survey prepared for the inquiry suggest that 44% of local authorities in England experience PPE being delivered to the NHS very or fairly often in the first 6 months of the pandemic. Christina McInerney from the TUC gave the examples of the lack of availability of PPE and guidance for domiciliary care workers, in contrast to the escalations in availability and advice to healthcare workers, many of whom would be visiting the same individuals, but with better IPC than their care counterpart. Reverend Charlotte Hudd spoke of the stark realisation that she had when she realised that funeral directors were coming into the nursing homes where she worked, suited and booted, in hazmat suits to protect them from her. But of course, the two examples, my lady, are also connected. Discharging people from hospitals before testing was widespread into locations where it was known that there was inadequate PPE. Then that only compounded an entirely foreseeable risk of infection within those settings. My lady, then to the future and recommendations on parity. The pandemic was a sliding doors moment, where those at the heart of government should have appreciated that social care needs and gripped the resources from the centre. As Caroline Abrahams from Age UK set out, there are 3 things that the inquiry should now recommend as a matter of urgency. First, there is a need for a genuine national care service in each of the 4 nations and jurisdictions, with more national infrastructure to support it. The current UK government has committed to a national care service, and the inquiry should state its unequivocal support for this policy commitment and the urgency of it. Second, there needs to be more recognition of the rights of older people and the rights of their carers to be real partners in their care. Third, there must be more structures within government to represent the rights of people with care needs. Helen Whately said that she often would be the only person at a high-level meeting with any input from social care. She also highlighted the need for the UK HSA, the NHS and the DHSC to think about the health of the whole population, including those with care needs. We would add to those recommendations the introduction of a real carer's wage and would emphasise that matters of resourcing are not outside the inquiry's terms of reference. As Miss Carey, King's Counsel, said to Miss Killian on Monday, my lady, you are under no illusions about the underfunding and the fragility of the adult social care sector. And whilst it might be a matter for the executive to determine the allocation of resources, the evidence of the impact of under-resourcing and disparities in resources and the fragility it creates is an entirely proper matter for the inquiry to make findings upon and indicate the areas in which additional infrastructure and resources are urgently required. Without recommendations focused on greater resourcing and an increase in capacity, no number of policies or guidance will address the core weaknesses. As Professor Barclay told you this morning, the way to make sure something really happens is to say, right, we're going to resource it. My lady, I then turn to my second area of recommendations, the issue of preparedness. You may recall that in Module 1, COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK made recommendations that legal duty should be placed on central government to ensure that up-to-date national planning, guidance, information sharing, oversight and assurance exist to prepare for the next inevitable pandemic. Helen Whately correctly identified that for robust planning, there needs to be multiple plans, the care provider level, the local authority level and a national level. But here there wasn't a national plan for social care, and the social care minister wasn't able to obtain the entirely inadequate local authority plans until March 2020. Cathy Williams told the inquiry that care providers need to have contingency plans according to regulations, but not pandemic plans. Joanna Killian confirmed that local authorities had to have pandemic flu plans, but that was the wrong plan for the pandemic that did in fact strike. It seems that local authorities in England are awaiting the recommendations from the exercise Pegasus in autumn 2025 to inform their work going forward. My lady, you asked Miss Killian what's in place for the recommendations of that exercise to be acted on, noting that key recommendations from exercise Cygnus weren't. The answer you received was vague and imprecise, but your recommendations can make clear that there should be a responsibility on both local authorities and care providers to have those pandemic plans in place, with a clear framework to ensure minimum standards and adequate central oversight. I now turn to my third area of recommendations, the issue around the lack of proper data and oversight. All the witnesses in this module, my lady, agree that there is an urgent need for better data infrastructure within adult social care. So 4 clear and obvious recommendations emerge. First, the need for a national register of care workers within each of the 4 nations. Second, more availability of data on the number of people who draw on care and support and those who care for them, to ensure better provision and access to essential pandemic response services such as vaccines, such as PPE. Third, the seamless linkage of social care and NHS data. And fourth, and better mortality data to identify who, when and why people die whilst receiving care. But data alone is nothing without on-the-ground intelligence and oversight. The inquiry's also heard of a lack of accountability and transparency within government at key moments in the pandemic response, what Caroline Abrams called the circling of the wagons, thereby further excluding those advocating on behalf of the sector. Of the greatest concern must be the lack of oversight of the sector. The CQC in non-pandemic times provides a supportive rather than directive role, and during the pandemic withdrew its inspectors, going AWOL, as Nadra Ahmed from the National Care Association put it. During a pandemic, there must be more scrutiny, not less, particularly behind closed doors. Both routine and emergency inspections must continue during a pandemic, not only to monitor whether effective IPCs, such as isolation and PPE, are in place, but to protect vulnerable people from neglect at a time when access and oversight by family and friends may be limited. Care Rights UK called this a line that should not be crossed. Moving then, my lady, to my 4th and final area of recommendations around a people-centred approach to care. The impact of the pandemic on those receiving social care was both devastating and disproportionate. 27,000 people died in care homes in the first wave, hence Alistair Donaldson's categorisation of it as a generational slaughter. There can be no doubt that the pandemic had a disproportionate effect on people in receipt of care. Professor Banerjee highlighted that those living with dementia suffered the highest level of mortality. This was entirely foreseeable, given that so many people living with dementia will be older in age and have complex comorbidities. But each of the 27,000 is a human being that was loved, and my lady, I know you cannot fail to have been moved by the evidence that's been heard in this module from those who lost their loved ones. May I remind you of the many and varied accounts from the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK and friends within the written statement of Jean Adamson. But what all of those harrowing stories highlight is the need for those at the centre to properly understand the nature and significance of compassionate, holistic and people-centred care. People in social care are people, not numbers or statistics or things to be moved around. The first example from the pandemic of the need for people-centred care is the restrictions imposed on visiting. My lady, I know from your questions of the witnesses that you are focused on the competing risks involved in creating guidance and visiting and the importance of balancing the need to reduce the risk of infection against the need for people receiving care to receive those visits from their family and friends. But your recommendations must reflect the recognition that visiting is more than just cups of tea. They are essential to the mental and physical well-being of those receiving care. Family and friends are often the ears, eyes, voices and memory for the people that they care for. Susan Gregson's story illustrates the distress and acute social isolation felt by people living with dementia. Susan moved into a nursing home in August 2020, and in that October, visits were stopped. Due to her dementia, Susan was unable to use the phone or Skype without considerable support. Her daughter Nicola describes the agony of those phone calls in the CBFFJ witness statement. When the care provider thought that Susan was at the end of her life, her family was allowed to visit, but when she rallied, those visits were once again stopped, a decision that will haunt Nicola forever. Not all care homes were even able or willing to facilitate electronic communications. Larry Byrne tells the inquiry that when his dad, Lawrence Byrne Sr., became unwell, the care home staff would not let Larry speak to him and was told that his father had been admitted to hospital by email. The right to visit is central to the well-being of those in receipt of care, especially during a pandemic, and the inquiry should be categorical in its support for essential care supporters being part of the care team in a future pandemic. Through the introduction of Gloria's Law, which Jane Weir-Wyboska told you about in her evidence at the start of these hearings. A second example of the need to deliver people-centred care is the use and abuse of DNA CPRs. Many CBFFJ families have provided evidence about DNA CPR notices being put in place for their loved ones without their knowledge or consent. It is clear from the evidence of Helena Herkelotz and Professor Rayner that these were not isolated incidents. Professor Rayner was clear that blanket DNA CPRs did happen and that there were people and families receiving letters and calls from clinicians informing them that they could be subject to the receiving of care, messages that no one should ever receive. Professor Barclay made no apology this morning for using the word shocking. It is yet further evidence, if it were needed, that there was a set of, as Professor Banerjee put it, a set of potential biases that entered into clinical decision-making and a generation of health and policy and delivery based on negative attitudes towards older people. Those who receive those letters still don't know how high up those decisions went to CCG level or above. But it's also another stark example of the capacity of the NHS taking precedence over the needs and lives of those receiving social care. And as we know from Linda Dinsdale's evidence this afternoon, and from Cameron Malik, and from Professors Hatton and Hastings, it wasn't just older people. It was people living with disabilities and receipt of care who were refused access to intensive care units or ventilators. The inquiry should not only be clear about the existence of blanket DNA CPRs, but also be clear in its recommendation that they can never be appropriate to propose or even tacitly permit. My lady, in conclusion, the pandemic exposed the fragility of the sector, and you now have before you the detailed and harrowing evidence and reflections of where the cracks are and the recommendations of the urgent reform that is needed. My lady, your findings and recommendations can inform and support the work of the Casey Review, but should not wait. The COVID bereaved families ask you not just to bear witness, but to be bold and to recommend the changes that are so desperately now needed. Thank you, my lady.
Extremely helpful, Ms Morris. Thank you very much indeed. Ms Campbell.
My lady, as you've just acknowledged, you've set us quite a task to address you on behalf of the bereaved in the aftermath of the powerful evidence you've heard this afternoon. What was said, how it was said, and what had to be left unsaid encapsulates the impact of the issues in this module upon the bereaved in a way which it would be impossible for any advocate to do. It's also impossible to listen to the evidence in this module and not to reflect upon its interrelationship with the evidence that you've heard in earlier modules. The poor preparation evidenced in Module 1, the chaos at the heart of Westminster in Module 2, which still hurts the bereaved, the dysfunction and division within the Northern Ireland Executive that intensified, in fact, as the pandemic continued, followed by a spike in deaths, you'll remember, in early 2021. The failure to initially consider the care sector in the procurement and distribution of PPE in Module 5, the missed opportunities for test, trace and isolate in Module 7. Much of the ground that you have covered in your earlier modules reaches denouement in this module, and for far too many, as we've just heard, the ending is far from happy. But having listened to all the evidence in Module 6, we know a great deal now about how it happened, but why so many in social care had to endure so much suffering and for so long remains elusive. It's not that as a society we don't love and cherish our older generation and all who rely on the care sector. Quite the opposite. Like many thousands of others, Agnes McCusker, from whom you heard at the outset of this module, and Gregory McQuitty, from whom you've just heard, loved their parents so much and wanted to protect them so dearly that they made the ultimate sacrifice and stayed away, even though every sinew of their being strained against that separation. And it's not that our governments and civil servants didn't know and had not been told before and during the pandemic that those reliant on the social care system required special consideration, not just by locking them away from the world, but considering how to keep them safe in the world. And it's not that sector expertise was not available, either from medical professionals or from voluntary community or charity sector representatives, or from residents and their families. The quality of the evidence that you've heard in this module from the bereaved, from expert witnesses, from Care Rights UK, John's Campaign, the Patients Association, Disability Action, Age UK, Canlungan, and more is powerful evidence of the value, insight and expertise that they can bring. Neither is it that the frailty of the care system wasn't fully appreciated or that the additional demands being placed on it in order, including to protect the NHS, were not clear from the outset, or that the statistics from China, from Italy, didn't reveal the threat that this virus presented to older people and the medically vulnerable. So why then did so many in the care sector suffer and die too often alone? It's possible that the inherent problems in the sector were just too many to be faced. We've heard the repeated refrain, sometimes accompanied by a gentle shrug of the shoulders, that it's the Cinderella service, as though that's the answer and not the problem. Is it because our respective governments, as you heard yesterday, don't really understand how the care sector works? Tens of thousands of providers, many of them privately owned and operating, providing a range of services that few in government have sufficient insight into? Or is it because the care sector is propped up by a workforce who traditionally just get on with it? A network of 1.6 million employed people and many millions more unpaid, the vast majority of whom compassionately, stoically, and with little expectation for acknowledgement or reward show up every day, go countless extra miles to ensure that care is delivered, problems are solved, and people are safe. Or does it reflect an inherent ageism and disableism in our society, that when you reach a certain stage in life, to borrow a quote from an earlier module, you've had a good innings and your time will be up soon enough anyway? My lady, the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved consider that all of those issues and more are interconnected and in our rapidly ageing society need urgent redress. And we wholeheartedly agree with the submissions that you've just heard from Miss Morris King's Counsel, urging the inquiry to be future-looking in its recommendation and reports. In order to do that from a Northern Ireland perspective, the starting point we again submit to you is to dismantle institutional defensiveness, to break down silos and to rebuild based on learning and collaboration. As Ms Sansom put to you so powerfully yesterday afternoon, you can't legislate for what you don't know or what you only understand in part. And we would add, neither can you issue guidance or fix or repair or properly seek to influence or control what you don't sufficiently understand. And the concern from a Northern Irish perspective is that there's still very much learning to be done. And touching, if I may, on some examples, starting with our integrated health and social care system, which has been held up as a beneficial feature time and again, and yet we know that there was little appreciable difference in terms of outcomes in Northern Ireland. We know that in the north, as with other regions, the health sector sees the care sector as there to support its effective functioning, and with too little understanding or value placed on how social care works independently and interdependently. It's clear from the evidence that whether integrated or not, care systems are seen by government as a lower priority and different to health systems. Given the weight of the evidence you've heard, I'll take that point as well established. But in Northern Ireland in particular, the care system has evolved absent any policy or plan to be operated in large part by disparate independent companies over which going into the pandemic and still the executive had very little insight or control. In reality, it's a system that isn't really integrated at all. And the department's failure to coherently address that is a core problem and a root cause of many of the problems which manifested. My lady, you're familiar with these problems, and you've been told they include no real understanding of the actual position of the care sector or real-time information from it as the pandemic emerged. As described in the evidence of Sean Holland, our former chief social worker, in the healthcare sector on any given morning, in the department. With a few phone calls, you could find out how many ICU beds were available, how many were occupied. Maybe you would know about staffing pressures. But the same was not true of care homes, much less domiciliary or home-based care. The consequences were almost inevitable, not just a lack of insight into the actual position in the sector, but then consequential difficulties in engaging with disparate independent providers in the development of policy and guidance, difficulties in securing the implementation of sector-wide guidance in a uniform manner, difficulties from the care sector's perspective in knowing where the guidance was going to come from, often receiving different sets of guidance from different agencies absent any clear lines of responsibility, and difficulties on the part of residents and their families in navigating this complex and fragmented system and knowing what their rights are within it. The Northern Ireland bereaved contend that these problems are not and should not be insurmountable. There are many areas of government where operational delivery is managed by independent providers. What is required is a mechanism to allow for its effective oversight and for engagement with the totality of independent providers and service users. And yet, our Department of Health still has no coherent plan for addressing this problem. The various discussions you heard during the evidence about potentially using legislation or using trust contracts with providers, or even establishing a social care trust to bring about a standardised sector, demonstrates the ongoing lack of thought that has been given to this problem. It's clear that the Department of Health's attempts to grapple with these issues haven't yet begun. And my lady, turning to care partner guidance, because that lack of oversight and control of the care sector is brought into stark relief by the attempts to implement this guidance. We will, of course, revisit this in our written submissions, but you know the problems that manifested when the department sought to issue sector-wide guidance that was resisted by a significant proportion of the sector. We recall again Sean Holland's evidence of the department's failure to fully consult with representatives of the independent care sector, the IHCP, apparently casually dismissing them as a small organisation who had by then had enough access already, and suggesting that the department's approach of dealing with individual care homes directly was sufficient. My lady, we looked at the chronology of correspondence in the evidence of Robin Swan, letter after letter ignored, frustrations expressed by the IHCP about the lack of responses from the department. We learned just yesterday in the evidence of Claire Sutton from the RCN were shared by her colleagues in the ISNMN, who over the same time raised the same issues and faced the same wall of silence. Simultaneously, we know that there were no enforcement attempts by the department, the RQIA or any other agency. Even offers of more funding made too little difference. My lady, I stress again that many within the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved reject the position adopted by those care homes that declined to implement the care partner guidance. It caused untold distress and harm. But the position of the department in not engaging with the sector representatives to address the intransigence was very clearly part of the problem. And the consequence of that impasse between providers and the department was felt most acutely by residents and their families. The Northern Ireland COVID bereaved corporate statement from this module reminds you of the evidence of Marion Reynolds, and you'll need no reminder of her evidence in Module 2C about her own experience in trying to gain access in autumn 2020 to the care home in which her much-loved Aunt Mary resided, and the experience of Martina Ferguson, who was one of those who campaigned relentlessly for care partner guidance, and yet was also one of those who was consistently refused access to her mother Ursula, who lived in the care of a large independent care home provider. We repeat our concerns that the department's self-congratulation on the development of care partner guidance in positioning itself as a world leader in patient-centred care is misplaced, or at the very least premature. The guidance, which of course can properly be credited to the determination of so many of the bereaved we represent, has not yet been given statutory or even contractual protections, which provides little reassurance to residents and families in the care sector at present. There is still, my lady, much work to be done. I touch briefly on the issue of hospital discharge into the care sector to note that the acceptance that you heard in evidence about the inherent weaknesses in the report of Dr. Herity represents a subtle shift from the position previously adopted by the Department of Health, both at the time of receipt of that report and up to and including the written statements in preparation for this module. At the height of the second wave in November 2020, under cover of a letter signed by the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Social Worker and the Chief Nursing Officer, Professor Herity's report was distributed to providers as evidence that the fears about the relationships between hospital discharges and outbreaks of COVID in care homes were, and I quote, unfounded. In evidence before you, however, there was a shift from that position, an acceptance that the lack of widespread testing of patients meant that the risks that arose from hospital discharge of untested patients couldn't be quantified. The Herity report was, as Professor McBride told you, a descriptive piece, but there were limitations in terms of the study, the main one being that there was very limited testing going on at that point in time, and only the individuals that were being tested were those with symptoms. That is, my lady, undoubtedly true. But the concern of the Northern Ireland bereaved is that the real-time shift by the department in their reliance on the Herity report in the course of this module in turn reveals an absence, at least until now, of any critical thinking within the department about the failures of the discharge policy during the pandemic, which doesn't bode well for any future pandemic planning. There is a clear need in our integrated system to consider what a future discharge policy would actually look like, including testing, appropriate facilities for isolation, contingencies where such facilities or tests are unavailable, and quarantine requirements. But again, there's little evidence that that work has begun. My lady, given the limited time available, we will return to other issues in writing, including the realities for domiciliary care, and you will recall clearly the evidence of Hazel Gray in Module 7, whose parents, up until their deaths, relied on the attendance of carers several times a day. Hazel told you of her shock at discovering that those carers were not routinely tested. That shock has echoed through the evidence in this module. We'll address the RQIA and the impossibility of having risk-led inspections when, as you were told by Breach Donaghy, the methodology for assessment of risk-led inspections hadn't been developed at the time that those in-person inspections stopped. We will address too the experiences of social workers during the pandemic and, of course, the impact on our massive workforce of unpaid carers, about which I have addressed you previously. And we will seek to assist you in identifying recommendations that future-proof the social care sector, which will inevitably include the need to collaborate, to consult and to learn, based on an understanding and appreciation of what the care sector achieves and why it is so important. It will include the need for parity of esteem between health and social care, so that each receive the necessary respect and investment, and that the communication lines between them, whether in an integrated system or not, are much better aligned. It must include investment in the workforce, building workforce resilience by increasing staff recruitment, retention, training, guidance, pay, safety, and psychological support. It must also include investment in buildings. This module hasn't heard much oral evidence on the topic, but the importance of having well-designed, future-proofed buildings is addressed, we know, within the written statements. The clear lines of responsibility that are needed for the procurement of PPE for care systems and health services. We will address the need to continue to invest in technological facilities to support greater levels of virtual visiting and healthcare for all of the reasons so eloquently stressed by Joanne Sansom yesterday, and the importance of implementing and maintaining a robust inspection regime. Within care homes, we need to think about appointing trained infection controllers, not just for nursing staff, but all staff should be trained in IPC measures. and also the prohibition or significant restriction on the movement of staff between care homes, and the need to place care partner guidance on a statutory footing once and for all. But above all, my lady, what is required is an understanding that mental health, well-being, emotional support and personal assistance with basic care needs are as important as protecting physical health, and that the removal of contact with loved ones is for many a price too great to pay. It was cruel, it was painful, and my lady, on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved, we suggest it must never be repeated. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your help, Ms Campbell. Can I just repeat, I know you know and Ms Morris knows, everyone knows, but just in case someone's following online who don't know, I will of course be paying extraordinarily close attention to any written submissions that people submit, just in case people wonder why you're having to go through. You and Ms Morris and Mr Stanton had limited time, so thank you. Mr Stanton.
Thank you, my lady. My lady, the oral closing statement on behalf of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, Cymru, is as follows. The findings of the Vivaldi study are a damning indictment of the failure to protect the most vulnerable within our society and raise serious questions about the extent to which the right to life was protected. The study found that 33% of surviving care home residents were infected with COVID-19 during the first wave, and that once infected, there was a 36% chance they would die. To show how wholly disproportionate these risks were, the ONS estimates that as of the 19th of August 2020, just 1.8% of those living in private households in Wales had been infected, and the death rate in the general population was around 1%. This closing statement highlights 4 specific areas of failure, all of which contributed to the appalling outcomes in care homes in Wales. First, testing failures. Testing decisions and policy in Wales were so slow, dysfunctional and reactionary that it's hard to know where to begin. Emails from Care Inspectorate Wales following a meeting with Welsh Government on the 22nd of April 2020 record that testing arrangements are fragmented and differ across Wales. There is no central lead for testing and no one could answer the question who or what organisation is in charge. Similarly, Professor Carrow confirmed during his evidence that there was a disconnect between Public Health Wales and Welsh Government at the end of April. The Welsh Government's position on testing has 2 key features. First, that the risk of discharging untested patients into care homes did not come to the fore until the 15th of April. Second, that it was not until the 12th of May that the balance tipped in favour of a programme of testing asymptomatic care home residents and staff. My lady, the Cymru Group submits that both these positions are false. In both cases, testing was required because of the risk of asymptomatic transmission. And my lady, you heard in Module 7 from Professors Fraser, Nurse and Harries that the evidence of asymptomatic transmission emerged quite clearly throughout February and March 2020 through studies from China, Hong Kong, Italy and the cruise ship Diamond Princess. And the US CDC study in early April provided strong evidence of high levels of asymptomatic transmission in care homes. This evidence was not hidden from Wales, it was publicly available and well understood. And just yesterday, you heard from the RCN, the largest group of frontline healthcare professionals, that asymptomatic transmission was very clearly apparent from the evidence prior to March. Given the extreme vulnerability of care home residents to COVID infection, a proper precautionary approach demanded asymptomatic testing both on discharge from hospital and routinely within care homes at the earliest opportunity. The Welsh Government decided against this precautionary approach and chose to prioritise testing elsewhere. But rather than own and explain this decision at the inquiry, they have hidden behind the science. My lady, the evidence demonstrating this will be fully set out in the group's written closing statement. However, for today's purposes, we highlight the following facts. Public Health Wales met with Public Health England on the 18th of April 2020 to discuss the results of the Easter 6 study. Directly following this meeting, Public Health Wales produced a meeting note at INQ 000 384 504 that includes the following statements. Quote, COVID-19 has proved highly infectious in closed settings. Once 3 or more cases are reported, there is around 50% prevalence in both staff and residents, despite apparent use of PPE. Most care homes will become affected over the next 6 weeks. There is also evidence of underreporting in deaths and of a rise in deaths in the care home setting. Possible measures to consider include prevention of entry into the home and more testing in staff, including asymptomatic. This report was shared with the Welsh Government immediately on the 18th of April, such was its significance, and prompted the drafting of ministerial advice the same day. This advice was not finalised until the 30th of April, an inordinate delay given the serious risk to life. And when finally produced, it advised against routine testing based on a lack of evidence in favour of asymptomatic testing and a lack of testing capacity. However, my lady, an earlier version of this advice at INQ 000 367 477, which was commenced on the 18th of April, states something very different about the evidence in favour of asymptomatic testing. It states, quote, our current policy in Wales is to test all symptomatic residents and staff. Evidence suggests that this approach results in asymptomatic COVID-19 individuals, many of whom will go on to develop symptoms, not being identified and a source of ongoing risk to residents and staff. International evidence suggests that increasing testing in care homes for asymptomatic staff will provide added protection against the virus. Inexplicably, these warnings that accurately reflected the scientific position at the time were removed from the final advice. The Welsh bereaved are outraged to discover from inquiry disclosure that the Welsh Government clearly knew from at least the 18th of April of the need for asymptomatic testing and yet continued to publicly deny its clinical efficacy until the 12th of May, after the damage of Wave 1 had already been done. This tactic of using claimed scientific advice to stifle debate and challenge sat uneasily with some of their scientists. For example, the message of the Welsh Chief Scientific Advisor for Health, Rob Orford, on the 27th of March 2021, asking ironically, quote, do we need some emergency science this weekend? The group submits that this cynical approach is now clearly exposed at the inquiry. The second failure is inadequate IPC and PPE. In previous inquiry modules, the group has highlighted the inadequacy of face masks to protect against airborne respiratory infection. Helen Hoff, who gave evidence on behalf of the group earlier in this module, is clear on this issue in her witness statement, stating, as nurses, we knew a surgical mask would not protect us. They do not fit your face, there are gaps at the side, and they're designed to stop the wearer coughing or passing infection to a patient. They do not prevent a healthcare worker from catching infection from a patient by inhaling infectious aerosols, which is why I was asking for FFP3. Helen Whately also raised this concern in her oral evidence when referencing the lower rates of infection amongst ICU staff who had the benefit of FFP3 respirators. And she described the inadequacy of PPE and RPE in social care settings as not good enough in light of the way COVID spread. COVID-19 was transmitting at high levels asymptomatically and by aerosol. The lack of appropriate respiratory protection, coupled with the absence of effective testing regimes and the very nature of adult residential care, which does not allow for social distancing and requires close personal care, created a perfect storm for the virus to transmit rapidly amongst extremely vulnerable people. The tragedy is that this was known from the outset by those on the front line, like Ms Hoff and the RCN, but ignored by decision makers. Alarmingly, current IPC guidance for acute respiratory infections in Wales continues to recommend that social care staff use surgical masks when caring for suspected or confirmed COVID-19 patients. Given the lack of adequate ventilation and isolation facilities in the majority of care homes in Wales and the need for the provision of close personal care, the ability to apply a hierarchy of controls in these settings is extremely limited. And in these circumstances, the continued recommendation of surgical masks shows how little has been learned from the tragic events of the pandemic. The third failure is that care home residents were deprioritised. Older people in Wales contributed more than any other group to the fabric of Welsh society, and yet their needs and rights were overlooked and dismissed time and again. Pandemic planning exercises gave almost no consideration to how the social care system might cope during a pandemic. And when the pandemic struck, care homes in Wales were wholly underprepared and inadequately supported. Despite knowing that older people in residential care and nursing homes were the most vulnerable to COVID-19 infection, the overwhelming focus was on protecting NHS capacity, which resulted in the withdrawal of in-person medical care, a refusal to provide ventilation, non-attendance by ambulance services, and a race to impose blanket DNA CPR notices. The inquiry has heard of the harrowing deaths of care home residents from COVID-19 without oxygen, palliative care, or medication to ease their suffering. Helen Hoff knew that oxygen would give relief to her dying patients, but many died without it, enduring unnecessary suffering. Ms. Hoff felt that nobody was speaking up for her patients, and she wrote to the Welsh Government officials in early May 2020, highlighting the disgraceful disparity between the treatment patients received in hospital and what could be provided in a nursing home. Similarly, a survey conducted by the Welsh Local Government Association received reports from 59% of local authorities in Wales that residents were not receiving adequate medical treatment. The Cymru Group agrees with Julia Jones of John's campaign that end of life should be understood as a period like infancy rather than as an event. And a potential recommendation for your consideration, my lady, is for there to be better preparation and training in this area to ensure a dignified transition over time. As Professor Barclay observed earlier today, we may not be able to affect the outcome, but we can influence the journey. Finally, on this issue, Professor Banerjee, in his evidence, said that if your internal compass faces away from people who are old, then you may be more likely to decide that individuals don't get a test, are sent back to their care homes or sent back home, rather than afforded the extra care that can be provided in a general hospital. The Cymru Group submits that this tendency was displayed very clearly by decision makers in Wales, as the next and fourth section of the failure to prepare for the second wave demonstrates. The second wave of the pandemic saw further huge loss of life in Welsh care homes. ONS data analysing deaths across England and Wales shows that Wales had the highest proportion of COVID-related deaths of care home residents in Wave 2 at 28.8%. It was well known that there would be a second wave of COVID-19, and this knowledge meant that its severity could have been mitigated. Monthly reporting to Care Inspectorate Wales shows how the number of suspected and confirmed COVID-19 deaths fell to single figures in July and August, before rising again in October, with then hundreds of deaths in November and December, reaching a peak of 460 COVID-related deaths in January 2021. The summer lull provided an opportunity to take steps to prevent further loss of life. However, not only was this opportunity squandered, decisions were in fact taken that placed care home residents at increased risk. The first was the decision on the 25th of November 2020 to intentionally delay the vaccination of care home residents contrary to the explicit recommendation of the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunisation. The reason that care home residents were the first JCVI priority cohort for vaccination was because of their extreme vulnerability and because vaccination had such a pronounced benefit. For every 20 residents vaccinated, one life was saved, compared to the need to vaccinate 8,000 people to save one life in the over 50s cohort. The requirement for ultra-low freezer capacity for the Pfizer vaccine was known from at least the 25th of August 2020, and the failure to procure the necessary freezer storage and develop a delivery plan for care homes in the 4 months to December, given the known risk to life, is inexcusable. All UK nations face this challenge, but the response of the Welsh Government was by far the least effective. Vaccinations in Wales commenced on the 8th of December. However, by the 26th of January 2021, a month in which care home deaths from COVID-19 were as high as 20 per day, only around 67% of care home residents had received their first dose. By the 16th of February, at the tail end of Wave 2, this number had risen to just 82%. In contrast, Scotland reached this level over a month earlier, on the 12th of January, and Northern Ireland delivered vaccinations to care home residents on the 8th of December, the first day of the programme. And by the 26th of February 2021, all residents and staff in their care homes had been offered a first and second dose. The Welsh Government's departure from the JCVI advice was discussed in a Cabinet Office meeting on the 12th of January 2021, when it was noted that Wales had taken a different approach to other nations by prioritising NHS staff for the Pfizer vaccine. This failure to provide life-saving vaccines until it was too late for so many vulnerable people is an unconscionable failure of the Welsh Government. The second decision was to discharge hospital patients with low-level positive tests to care homes from the 15th of December 2020. The risk was described as low, however there remained uncertainty, and the fact that the Welsh Government was prepared to take this risk with the lives of care home residents at a time when deaths in care homes were rising rapidly, having already suspended vaccinations and knowing the devastating impact of infection once it entered a care home, disproves the claims of the Welsh Government that the most vulnerable in Wales were at the heart of their decision-making. And my lady, similar unsafe practices around this time are a feature of Ms Griffiths' story, who you heard from earlier today, and whose father was admitted to hospital on the 9th of November 2020 with a COVID infection for just 24 hours before being discharged back to the care home while infected. My lady, in conclusion, the anger felt by bereaved families in Wales is not just rooted in the loss of their loved ones, but in the neglect and indignity that they suffered, and in the Welsh Government's refusal to accept their mistakes. The Welsh Government needs to step up and take responsibility for what went wrong so that there can be learning and improvement and so that families can begin to move on. And if the evidence heard in this module does not convince them to do so, nothing will. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Stanton. I'm genuinely grateful. Right, I don't think anyone's been warned to continue this evening anyway. It's been a very long and difficult day, so I think we shall end now and I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you, my lady.
All right.